11 Japanese snipers stopped an entire American battalion. Not tanks, not artillery, not a fortified defensive line, just 11 men nobody could see. In 72 hours, they killed 14 American soldiers near Point Cruz on Guadalcanal and turned the coconut groves into a place men entered like they were walking to their own execution. Patrols came back carrying dead men. Medics became targets. Officers started losing control of their troops. Army rifles didn't solve it. Machine guns only shredded leaves. Command was already thinking about burning the groves out with flamethrowers and pounding them with artillery. But then a young lieutenant showed up with a forbidden civilian rifle, a rifle his own officers had laughed at. And in just a few days, he did what an entire battalion couldn't. Stay with this story to the end, because the real point isn't how many snipers he killed. It's how one man broke the military system because he understood one brutal truth. Sometimes, rules get men killed faster than the enemy does. January 22nd, 1943, Guadalcanal, the Point Cruz sector. The humidity is so thick, your uniform sticks to your skin within minutes. The air is hot, heavy, almost solid. The ground is a mix of mud, rotting leaves, coconut husks, and blood. All around are palms, banyan trees, and dense jungle where a man can vanish in 2 steps. On a map, it's just a patch of ground west of Point Cruz. On the ground, it's a trap. The soldiers of the 132nd Infantry Regiment already know one thing. If the groves go quiet, that doesn't mean they're safe. It means somewhere above them, a Japanese rifleman has settled behind his sights and picked his next target. In the last 3 days, 14 Americans have died here. The pattern is always the same. A sharp crack, a man drops. Someone yells for a medic. The medic runs forward, and seconds later, he falls too. Then silence again. No firefight. No visible position. Just jungle that seems to kill men by itself. And this is where the story begins, with a man his own side first saw as a problem, and then as a solution. The Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal weren't random riflemen who happened to shoot well. They were using a cold, deliberate, almost suicidal method. A sniper would choose a tree in advance, a palm, a banyan, any high position with a view over a trail, a clearing, a bunker, or an approach to the American lines. Then he would climb up, settle into the branches, camouflage himself with leaves, netting, and scraps of cloth, and sometimes tie himself to the trunk or a fork in the tree. It sounds insane, but there was logic to it. If he was wounded or passed out from exhaustion, he wouldn't immediately fall. If he was killed, his body might stay hanging there, and the Americans might not realize the position had been taken out. He carried water, rice, and ammunition. He wasn't planning to leave quickly. He went up there like a suicide fighter with a rifle. His job wasn't just to kill one soldier. His job was to make an entire platoon, company, or battalion fear every single tree. That's why the tactic was so terrifying. A soldier can survive an artillery barrage if he knows where it's coming from. He can face an attack if he can see the enemy. But when friends start dropping one by one, and all you can see is leaves, your mind starts to crack. The Americans tried to deal with it the normal way. They fired automatic weapons into the treetops. Bullets tore through leaves, knocked down coconuts, sliced branches, and the snipers stayed alive. They sent their best riflemen in with M1 Garands. The Garand was an excellent infantry rifle, fast, reliable, powerful. But it wasn't a precision tool for hitting a barely visible target hidden inside a tree canopy. They used issued sniper Springfields with scopes. On paper, that made sense. In reality, there was humidity, mud, fogged glass, narrow angles, and an enemy who never exposed himself 1 second longer than he had to. In the jungle, you don't simply spot the sniper. You almost never see the whole man. You see a hint, a wrong shadow, a line that's too straight, a tiny flash of metal, a branch that moves differently from the others. And if you fire and miss, you've just told the enemy exactly where you are. That's why the commanders were furious. They had men, they had weapons, they had ammunition. What they didn't have was an answer. And that's when a rifle appeared in this story. A rifle that, by regulation, should never have been on the island at all. That rifle belonged to 2nd Lieutenant John Bower George. He didn't look like a man about to become a legend. No theatrical toughness, no loud hero act. Just a young officer from Illinois, calm, controlled, with the kind of eyes a real marksman has, the kind that see first, think second, and act only after that. Before the war, he was already known in shooting circles. In 1939, at 21 years old, George won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, becoming the youngest winner in the competition's history. 1,000 yards is not hitting something out there. At that distance, wind changes several times between you and the target. One mistake in breathing, trigger control, or range estimation turns a good shot into a miss. George didn't rely on luck. He calculated. He felt the rifle. He understood bullet drop, trajectory, wet air, light, and how a tiny tremor in the fingers could ruin everything. To him, a rifle wasn't just an object. It was a tool you had to know down to the last screw. Before shipping out to the Pacific, George did something many officers thought was insane. He brought along a civilian Winchester Model 70 chambered in .30-06 Springfield, fitted with a 2.5 power Lyman Alaskan scope. It wasn't standard Army issue. It wasn't a weapon covered by normal supply chains. Army armorers didn't have boxes of spare parts or manuals for it. It was his personal rifle, bought with his own money. Officers called it a hunting toy, a mail-order rifle, a bastard rifle, because it didn't fit Army procedure. Someone asked if he planned to shoot Japanese soldiers or deer. Someone else said this kind of freelancing would end in a court-martial. Command told him to leave it in the rear. George listened calmly. He wasn't arguing just to argue, but deep down, he knew one thing. If the job came down to precision shooting, he would trust the rifle he knew for years over a weapon pulled from an Army rack. And this detail matters. His decision wasn't swagger. He didn't bring a personal rifle to look special. He brought it because he understood its capabilities better than staff officers understood jungle warfare. At first glance, his critics had a point. The Winchester Model 70 was a bolt-action rifle with a 5-round magazine. After every shot, you had to work the bolt. The average infantryman had a semi-automatic M1 Garand with 8 rounds. In close combat, that difference mattered. But counter-sniper work is not close combat. Here, it's not about who can dump rounds faster. It's about the first accurate shot. Sometimes the second, rarely the third. If you miss, the enemy may not give you a chance to fix it. George's Winchester had an accurate barrel, a smooth bolt, solid bedding, a trigger he understood, and a scope he trusted. The Lyman Alaskan didn't give huge magnification, but it was rugged and practical. In the jungle, a 2.5 power optic could actually be better than a high-powered one. Wider field of view, easier target tracking, better awareness of movement around the aiming point. George understood something the Army would only learn later. In terrain like this, a sniper doesn't just need to see far, he needs to see wide. The night before he went out, George sat in his tent, cleaning the Winchester. Around him, exhausted soldiers tried to sleep. Someone coughed. Someone cursed in his sleep. Someone quietly talked about home. Outside, rain hit the canvas. Generators hummed somewhere in the dark. Beyond the security line, the jungle waited. George stripped the rifle, checked the barrel, checked the scope mounts, checked the cartridges. Every movement was calm, almost ordinary, but there was nothing ordinary about what it meant. In the morning, he would go into a place entire patrols were already afraid to enter. If the rifle failed, if the scope shifted, if he misread a position, there might be no second chance. There's no clean movie moment here where the hero says, "I've got this." More likely, he understood the risk and accepted it. And that makes the story stronger. He wasn't invincible. He was just more prepared than the men around him. At dawn on January 22nd, George took position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. The bunker was damaged. Debris, wood fragments, coral dust, and mud were scattered around it. But for a marksman, it was a decent spot. Shade, cover, and a field of view into part of the grove. He didn't gather a crowd. This wasn't a shooting range demonstration. Every extra man meant movement, coughing, rustling, tobacco smoke, a flash off a helmet. In the jungle, any of that can get you killed. George settled low, rested the Winchester, and began to watch. Not the way a frightened man scans every tree at once. He watched methodically, left to right, bottom to top, trunk to branches, branches to shadows, then back again. He wasn't looking for a Japanese soldier in the obvious sense. He was looking for a break in the natural pattern. And this is key. A good jungle sniper isn't the man with the most expensive scope. He's the man who notices that one branch isn't moving when the others are, or that one clump of leaves is too dense, or that a shadow in a forked tree holds its shape too long. At 9:17, he saw the first movement. A banyan tree about 240 yards away. A branch shifted slightly, very slightly. Most men would have blamed the wind, a bird, a monkey, anything. But there was almost no wind. George stayed on the glass. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a dark patch in the fork of the tree stopped being a patch. It became a human shape. A Japanese sniper was looking toward an American supply route. He had probably already chosen a target. George didn't fire instantly. That matters. A beginner's finger jumps on the trigger the second he sees the enemy. An experienced marksman makes sure the shot ends the problem instead of starting a panic. George judged the distance, his breathing, the angle, the slight movement of air. Then he pressed the trigger. The Winchester cracked, dry and sharp. Through the scope, he saw the figure jerk, fall through the branches, and drop to the ground. The first sniper was down. But George didn't let himself relax. He worked the bolt and kept watching. Because if that first rifleman had a partner, the second man was already looking for him. At 9:43, he found the second one. This sniper was north of the first position and already trying to move. That was the natural reaction. If your comrade gets killed nearby, the position is compromised and you climb down or shift trees. But that was the mistake. When he was motionless in the canopy, the Japanese rifleman was almost impossible to separate from the leaves. Once he moved, he became a man again. George led the target and fired. The second sniper fell, his rifle clattering through branches on the way down. 2 shots, 2 results. And now an invisible message moved through the groves. The Americans had found a way to see the men who thought they were invisible. That was dangerous for the Japanese. It was also dangerous for George. From that moment on, he was no longer just a shooter. He was the target. By noon, rumors were moving through the battalion faster than official reports. That guy with the civilian rifle dropped several of them. With that rifle? Yeah, that one. Men who had laughed at the Winchester the day before now wanted a closer look. Some wanted to see the rifle. Some wanted to see the shooter. Some wanted proof the story was real. But George didn't turn the job into a show. He knew the more attention around a firing position, the greater the chance the Japanese would notice movement, light, noise, or a cluster of men. So he stayed cold. No audience, no victory pose. Just the sector, the rifle, and the trees. And then the Japanese started answering. At 11:21, a bullet punched into a sandbag just inches from his head. Dirt and grit sprayed across his face. That was not random fire. Someone had figured out the area he was working from. George rolled aside, pressed himself against the bunker wall, and did not pop back up. The biggest mistake after a near miss is trying to immediately find the shooter. That's exactly what the enemy wants. He waited. The seconds stretched out. The jungle went quiet again. Then he slowly returned to the scope. But now he was looking differently. He wasn't hunting for the man who had just fired. He was hunting for the man expecting his reaction. It was a contest of patience. The Japanese sniper above might think the American was wounded or pinned down. George wanted him to think that. Eventually, he spotted the third. A banyan canopy. A barely readable outline. The sniper had shifted branches but stayed within the same position. To an ordinary soldier, that meant nothing. To George, it was enough. One shot, and the third target disappeared. By evening, George had 5 Japanese snipers down. 5 in one day, in conditions where entire units had previously failed to find anyone. Commanders stopped talking about freelancing. Now they wanted to know if he could keep going. George understood the truth. From here on, it would only get harder. The first targets believed they were invisible. The remaining snipers now knew someone had come for them. January 23rd began with rain. Not light rain, not refreshing rain, heavy, angry tropical rain. Water filled your eyes, ran down your helmet, turned the ground into paste, and made your uniform heavier by the minute. In the jungle, rain isn't just bad weather, it's part of the fight. It hides sound, washes away tracks, changes scent, fogs optics, and makes hands slip on wood and steel.
For Japanese snipers, rain was cover too. Under that noise, they could move, shift positions, climb down, climb higher. When the rain eased, George started searching again. He didn't rush. He let the jungle settle back into its normal rhythm. Only then did he start picking out what didn't belong. Around 9 in the morning, he spotted a target nearly 290 yards out. The Japanese had chosen a longer range position. That was adaptation. They had figured out that this American was dangerous at ordinary engagement distances, so they tried to push out farther. But for a man who had won competitions at 1,000 yards, 290 yards wasn't extreme. It was work. George fired. The sniper fell. But the Japanese were learning fast, too. Soon, mortars started landing near his position. The first rounds fell short. The second salvo came closer. Anyone with experience knows what that means. The third one might land right on top of you. George didn't wait to find out.
He grabbed the Winchester and left the bunker. Seconds later, explosions tore through his old position. Dirt, splinters, stone, and dust blasted upward. If he had stayed a few seconds longer, the story would have ended right there. He moved north to a fallen tree, found a new angle, settled back down, and kept watching. This is one of the most important parts of the whole story. George survived not because he was brave. Brave men were everywhere on Guadalcanal, and many of them died. He survived because he didn't fall in love with a comfortable position. A good position, once exposed, becomes a grave. Later, he would drill that lesson into other shooters. That afternoon, he killed 2 more snipers. One had chosen a very high position, almost at the top of a tree. In the morning, it might have been perfect. Height, view, leaves, a tough angle from below. But by late afternoon, the sun had shifted, and his silhouette started to stand out against the sky.
George saw it before the Japanese rifleman realized his cover had become a trap. By the end of the second day, there were 8 confirmed snipers down. 8 out of 11. To the battalion, it sounded like a miracle. To George, it sounded like a warning. The remaining 3 weren't random survivors. They had lasted through 2 days of being hunted. They had seen roughly where he was shooting from. They had heard the rhythm of his rifle. They knew they weren't facing an ordinary infantryman. That night, George cleaned the Winchester and didn't think about victory. He thought about the traps they would set in the morning. And he was right. The third day would be the most dangerous. On the morning of January 24th, George did not return to the damaged bunker or the fallen tree. That would have been too predictable. He chose a stone position the Marines had once used as a machine gun nest. It gave him a little height and a different angle.
That matters in the jungle. A target invisible from ground level can become visible from just a few feet higher. At 8:17, George saw a Japanese sniper in a palm tree about 190 yards away. He saw him too well. Too conveniently. The sniper was low in the palm, partly hidden by fronds, but to George he looked almost like a gift. George began to press the trigger, and stopped. This is the moment that decides everything. Most men would have taken the shot. After 2 days of success, it's easy to believe you're smarter than everyone else. But George felt something was wrong. The remaining Japanese snipers shouldn't be making mistakes this obvious. So it wasn't a mistake. It was bait. He took his finger off the trigger and started searching not for the visible sniper, but for the man who had to be covering him. For 11 minutes, he checked the trees around the palm. 11 minutes with a visible target sitting in the scope. The kind of situation where anyone else would say, "Just shoot already." George waited. Finally, he found the real threat. A banyan tree to the northwest, high up, almost perfect position. Branches, vines, shadow, and a view over the place where the American would fire from if he took the bait. The Japanese had done it right. They had placed one shooter as the lure and another as overwatch. If George had fired immediately, The second man could have killed him while he worked the bolt or shifted position. But now, George knew the setup, and he decided to turn it back on them. First, he fired at the bait in the palm. The sniper fell. In the same instant, George swung the rifle to the banyan. The real shooter had to react, turn his head, shift his shoulder, raise his rifle. That was enough. A second shot, and the Overwatch man fell too. But in those 2 seconds, George gave himself away. And the Japanese had been waiting for exactly that. A moment later, machine gun fire ripped through the stones where he had just been lying. Bullets smashed rock chips loose, cut leaves, and kicked dust from the cracks. If he had stayed there even a few seconds longer, he would have been torn apart. But George had already rolled away, dropped into a drainage ditch, and then moved into a water-filled shell hole. The water came up to his chest. Dirty, warm, foul-smelling water, with rotting leaves and insects floating on top. He held the rifle so the barrel wouldn't fill and barely moved. Picture that. Humid jungle all around, men hunting you who know how to wait for hours, a rifle in your hands, a few rounds left, mud in your eyes, water in your clothes, and you can't even shift your weight properly. And somewhere nearby, the last sniper is still out there. The most careful one, the angriest one, the most patient one. For almost an hour, George searched for him in the trees.
And for almost an hour, he was wrong. Because the last sniper wasn't above him anymore. He was on the ground, crawling. Low, slow, almost blending into the undergrowth, the Japanese rifleman moved along the tree line toward George's earlier positions. This was no longer passive defense. He had gone hunting. He knew the American was somewhere nearby, and he wanted to find him first. George didn't spot the movement right away. At first, it was only a disturbance in the grass, then a dark line, then the shape of a man. The Japanese soldier reached the stones and took position looking east. He assumed George had gone that way. His back was exposed. It looked like the perfect shot. But after the palm tree trap, George no longer trusted easy targets. He waited. And once again, that saved his life. A few minutes later, he spotted the second Japanese soldier behind a fallen log to the northwest. That man was covering the first. Maybe he wasn't a sniper. Maybe he was infantry support.
It didn't matter. If George fired immediately, the second man would have his position. Now everything came down to self-control. George sank deeper into the water, almost to his chin. He held the Winchester upright. He tried not to breathe too loudly. The Japanese decided the American had moved farther away. They began sweeping the area, moving roughly parallel to each other. They passed near the shell hole, close enough that George could hear boots in the mud and short spoken phrases. He didn't move. He didn't shoot too early. He didn't let fear take over his trigger finger. When both Japanese soldiers were between him and the trees, with their backs turned, he rose out of the water. It must have looked almost unreal. A filthy man with a rifle rising out of a flooded crater like something from a swamp. He shouldered the Winchester and fired at the nearest man. He dropped. Bolt back, bolt forward. The second Japanese soldier was already turning, raising his weapon. George fired first. The second shot cracked before the enemy could shoot. The 11th sniper was dead. The Point Cruz Groves, which had held a battalion in fear for 3 days, finally went quiet. But the danger still wasn't over. Voices came from the jungle. A Japanese group was moving toward the scene. Maybe a patrol, maybe a team sent to check the positions or recover weapons. George slipped back into the water. He heard them approach, talk, examine the bodies. Then they noticed tracks in the mud. They started moving toward the shell hole. George had only a few rounds left. There were at least 6 of them. This was no longer a sniper duel. This was a close-range situation with almost no way out. When the first Japanese soldier looked down into the hole, their eyes met. George fired from the water. The man fell backward. George worked the bolt, rose, fired again, then climbed out the other side and ran for the fallen tree. He wasn't trying to defeat them all.
That's the difference between real war and a pretty legend. A professional knows when to disappear. With a bolt-action rifle against a group of infantrymen, you don't last long. He broke contact and made it back to the American lines. When George returned, he was soaked, filthy, exhausted, and carrying a rifle that needed a full cleaning. But he was alive, and he brought back a result no one could ignore. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated. The threat that had killed 14 Americans and stalled the advance was gone. Men who had called his rifle a violation of regulations now looked at it differently. Not because they suddenly loved civilian weapons, because facts hit harder than orders. Before George, the groves were a kill zone. After George, the battalion could move again. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one marksman. Command asked the right question. Can this be repeated? Can other men be taught to see like this, wait like this, shoot like this?
George didn't promise miracles. He said they could try. But they needed the right men, the right training, and the right rifles. That's how a sniper section began to form. Not some glossy elite unit out of a movie, but a small, practical attempt to fix a deadly hole in American tactics. George didn't teach men how to be heroes. He taught them how to survive and get the job done. He explained that a jungle sniper had to be more patient than the enemy, that you never stay in a firing position after it's exposed, that you never shoot at the first convenient target if it looks too convenient, that the observer is often more important than the shooter because he sees what the shooter misses through the scope. He taught them to look not for a person, but for what didn't belong: a branch without movement, a shadow that held its shape, the flash of a lens, leaves arranged too neatly. He explained that sound, smell, birds, insects, everything could be a clue.
If birds suddenly go silent in one sector, someone may have moved through. If insects lift from the grass, someone may be crawling. That isn't mysticism. That's attention to detail turned into a craft. Within days, his men were going out in pairs, shooter and observer. They worked west of the Matanakaw, hunting Japanese observers, covering riflemen, and isolated positions. Results came quickly. American patrols moved with more confidence. Japanese soldiers who had once felt invisible started dying. Casualties dropped. And just as important, the mood changed. Before this, the jungle felt like a place where the American was always the prey. Now there was a sense that Japanese snipers could be hunted too. Psychologically, that is huge. A soldier moves differently when he knows someone nearby can take out an invisible shooter before that shooter kills a medic or a sergeant. War is not just maps and orders. It is also the belief that you are not being sent forward to die blind. In early February, George was wounded. A bullet struck his left shoulder, passing through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He was lucky, though lucky is a strange word on Guadalcanal. He was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors ordered him out of combat for several weeks. While he was recovering, the campaign was ending. The Japanese secretly evacuated the remains of their force. On February 9th, American troops reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. Guadalcanal was secured. The island that sailors, Marines, and soldiers had paid for in blood over months of fighting was finally in Allied hands. But George's war wasn't over. Later, he volunteered for Burma and joined the unit that would become known as Merrill's Marauders. And there, his experience mattered again. Burma was a different war. Long marches, mountains, rivers, disease, hunger, crushing humidity, Japanese ambushes, and the constant feeling that the rear existed only on a map. Merrill's Marauders marched hundreds of miles through territory where everything was trying to kill them: the enemy, fever, mud, lack of food, and their own exhaustion. George took the Winchester with him there too. But Burma taught him another hard lesson. No weapon is the answer to everything. In some fights, a sniper rifle mattered a lot. In others, the enemy appeared at only a few dozen yards, and what mattered more was a semi-automatic rifle, grenades, reaction speed, and the ability to keep functioning when exhaustion should have broken you. That experience made him not a fanatic for one weapon system, but a man who looked at weapons honestly. He understood. A good weapon is the one that fits the job. A bad doctrine is when men are forced to solve different problems with one template. After the war, John George didn't turn his story into a show. He didn't run to newspapers. He didn't play the role of the deadliest rifleman. Instead, he wrote a book, Shots Fired in Anger.
It wasn't a typical heroic memoir. It was more like a hard, detailed, sometimes dry breakdown of what weapons actually worked in combat and what failed. He wrote about the M1 Garand, the Springfield, the Winchester, Japanese rifles, scopes, ammunition, supply, tactics, and command mistakes. No grandstanding, no fake drama. That's why people respected it. They read it not for pretty sentences, but for the experience of a man who tested weapons not on a range, but in jungles where mistakes cost lives. For shooters, military historians, and instructors, the book became valuable because George wasn't selling theory. He was reporting what he had seen. George himself stayed reserved. He returned to civilian life, studied, worked, taught, and dealt with international affairs. Many people around him knew he had served in the Pacific, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know how 14 men died in 72 hours in the groves near Point Cruz. They didn't know how a young lieutenant was mocked for carrying a civilian rifle. They didn't know how he lay in dirty water while Japanese soldiers passed nearby. And maybe he didn't tell everyone because the story wasn't important. Maybe he stayed quiet because, for people who live through things like that, war doesn't always become a collection of impressive memories. Sometimes it is simply something you did because it had to be done, and then carried inside you for the rest of your life. John Bower George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. His name rarely made big headlines, but his story still matters because it isn't really about a superhuman sniper with a rifle. It is about something more honest and more uncomfortable. It is about a system that sometimes clings to rules long after those rules stop working. It is about a man who didn't break regulations for ego, but took the risk because he understood the problem better than the people writing the orders.
It is about a rifle they called a toy until it saved lives. Before George entered the Point Cruz groves, American soldiers were dying without ever seeing the enemy. After his work, the battalion moved forward. And the lesson is simple, but brutal. War is not won by the man who blindly follows instructions. It is won by the man who knows when the instructions have stopped saving lives. Sometimes one trained man, with the right tool and a cold head, can do more than an entire system that is too afraid to admit it is wrong.